Okay, so in our quest to try to determine who is responsible for what happened to the Hebrew Matthew in translation to Greek, to create this impression of a virgin birth account, to remove Joseph as the father begetting Jesus, and also someone who also added Jechoniah to the genealogy to block Jesus as possibly being a Davidic heir for a second reason. Who had all the motives? Who had all the opportunity? Well, it was important we know what date and time period this is taking place, and it happens to be in the time that Marcion is alive, and also who will find out who is the likely person who committed the crime, in a sense, made the translation of the Hebrew Matthew to Greek and made these changes. It will be Theodosian, a follower of Marcion, who was also a famous translator. And he was somebody who also liked Paul's translations and used them in his translations of Isaiah. Not he didn't use Septuagint, he used Paul's translations. So we'll get into that in a minute. So what did we prove in the last episode in this series? Well, basically the Ebionites, which is the name of the church of the 12 apostles and run by James, in the next generation, around near to 200 AD and maybe through 220, somewhere in there, the Ebionites engage Symmachus, a famous world-class translator from Hebrew to Greek, who translated the entire Bible in Hebrew, from Hebrew to Greek. They were adamant that the virgin birth story is not original, and they hired Symmachus, or engaged him, or maybe he volunteered, a professional translator to support them in their well-recognized campaign of the early 200s to fight the Greek translation of their own Hebrew Matthew. So Symmachus was an expert in Hebrew to Greek translation, so he was a perfect guy for them. As we showed you in the last episode, Eusebius's quote in church history at book 6, verse 17 makes clear Symmachus was obviously trying to prove a Greek translator of the Hebrew Matthew kept at Caesarea, so that's where the Hebrew Matthew was, had wrongly rendered Alma as virgin and then invented the virgin birth stories woven into the text. And again, it's not absolutely clear that the virgin birth story from, that the account from Isaiah 7 verse 14 was even in the Hebrew Matthew, but it was added or was present and then mistranslated to be about a virgin, and then all the stories are made to fit that. And again, just be patient. You may not agree, but I want to show you who you don't realize many times. You don't have an idea. You think the virgin birth account is just this nice story. It has all kinds of implications that suit the Marcionite doctrines, and we'll get into that in the next slide. So this next section, we're going to try to prove to you that Marcion and Theodotion worked together to create what we now know as the virgin birth account. It's most likely these are the two. I mean, they're the perfect match doctrinally and monetarily and the capability. So Marcion had the money, he had the doctrine. Jesus did not come in human flesh. He was God from birth. He also wasn't Messiah. We have to know that's a strange thing you might not realize. And the genealogy destroys Jesus as Messiah if you really think about it. Jesus doesn't have a father who's in the Davidic line, and even if it was Joseph, somebody put Jechoniah in the list who would block Jesus being an heir to the Davidic throne. So somebody was deliberately trying to destroy Jesus, and Marcion has all the motive to do that. And then Theodotion, who would Marcion have to use to make a translation from Hebrew into Greek? Marcion doesn't know Hebrew, but Theodotion is an expert in it, and he's a world-class expert. Well, I don't know if he's a world-class, not in the same league with Symmachus, but also right up there. And so now we're going to study their biographies, and we'll see how it all fits. Okay, so if you look at the map on the right, you're going to see the Black Sea. We know there are all these wars going on now in Ukraine to the north, but below that is what's modern Turkey. Then it was known as Asia, a province inside of Rome, the Roman Empire. And on that, see the arrow I wrote there? Well, it looks real small, but it's the city of Sinope, Sinope. And this is where Marcion had his shipbuilding business, and you can see all the ships he just launched right into the Black Sea. Then they could go through the passages that go out to the Mediterranean Sea and so on, or they could go north and go into Europe. So I mean, he had a fantastic business. He was making a lot of money, and he could do whatever he wanted. He was spreading his view that Paul is the only apostle, that Jesus is God, but he didn't have a virgin birth account. He used Luke, but Luke didn't have any of the early references to the virgin birth, and that's what scholars always say. If the virgin birth was in there, why wouldn't he have used it? It totally suits his doctrine that Jesus is God from birth. It also suits the doctrine that Jesus really didn't have human flesh. That is actually what I showed you in the last video, that Hilary claimed because Jesus was born of a virgin, he had suffered no pain on the cross. That it was like taking a sword and piercing water with it. You can't hurt water. Piercing a flame. Hilary says you can't hurt a flame. Jesus had God in him from birth, so he could control all the elements of the world and weapons against him. Nothing could hurt him. He can block it all. So his humanity was gone once you start with the birth. He's God from birth, and that's what completely matched Marcion's doctrines. So Marcion is supposed to have passed around 160 AD, but Theodosian is understood to have lived to 200. So he outlives Marcion by 40 years. But he was a Marcionite. Reputedly, he became a Jew later in life. That could be true, but we also don't know what point that happens. There's no specific date. Could be right at the end of life. Who knows? So, but Theodosian, has all the tools necessary, and all they got to do is go make a short trip. Now, I'm not going to say it's short. By modern techniques, you could get there in an hour and a half. But Caesarea is where the Hebrew Matthew was kept, and even Jerome was able to go to Caesarea and look at the Hebrew Matthew, and he sat there for weeks making a translation from the Hebrew into Greek, Hebrew into Latin. So he made both copies. And remember, these were all destroyed in the episodes when the Catholic Church was going against everything that was any historical memory of the Ebion had to be destroyed. That included the Hebrew Matthew in all forms, its original form, and even these copies. It was sacrilegious to the core. They don't care. Doctrine comes first. Documentation from the early church, that's like secondary, down way at the bottom. So anyway, that's what this gentleman must have done. Theodosian must have gone out of Caesarea, sat there in the library, made his translation. The person didn't know he was an enemy in the midst. He was serving Marcion. This could have been done as early while Marcion is still living. Marcion has the bucks to start promoting it, and over time it starts getting out, and Christians might not have even known who created it, and nobody noticed the oddity of maybe how it began. So whatever date it was, but the alarm only went up around 200 AD from the Ebionite Church, and that's the successors to James and the 12. Let's look at Marcion's motives, opportunity, his money, and he had a handy member of the Marcionic movement. Theodosian, maybe I didn't mention that, he's a member of the Marcionite movement. He is a Marcionite he was a world famous translator from Hebrew to Greek. So why do I say he's the likely originator of the virgin birth before he died around 160 AD? Well, number one, he had the means as a shipbuilder from Pontus to have books made, translations made, and distribute them anonymously. Nobody has to know where they're coming from. It would be used by his group of people, and these would be, he would even corrupt them, the Hebrew Matthew, you see. So he doesn't just have to use Luke. What he really needs is he needs a birth narrative that matches what will fit him. So let me keep going. Number two, he had the theological motive to make Jesus born of a virgin, as he believed Jesus was God from birth, and did not have true human flesh that could feel pain. And again, I showed you last week or a couple of videos ago that's how virgin birth was interpreted. And I showed you Aquinas making the same argument. If you're born of a virgin, God, you don't really have true human flesh. You don't suffer pain. Just like Marcion was contending with, and this is reflected in Tertullian's book, Jesus in the Flesh, or Christ in the Flesh. So he was telling us, Tertullian is telling us, these are the doctrines of Marcion. So we can see that the virgin birth had these same parallel interpretations by the Catholic Church later, that it meant Jesus didn't really have human flesh, that he couldn't be hurt because he was God from birth as a due to the virgin birth. Okay. 3, Marcion did not believe Jesus was Messiah, so creating a modified genealogy suited him well, for our current genealogy in Matthew destroys Jesus' Messiahship in 2 ways. Sorry, everybody, you don't like to hear it, but it's true. It cut off Jesus as father of Jesus. It cut off Joseph as father of Jesus, and hence Jesus is not from the Davidic line just for that fact alone. But now, second, it added Jechoniah, whom Jeremiah cursed, as no heir. This is in Jeremiah 22, I think it is. Cursed as he would never have an heir who would sit on the throne of David, which would also end Jesus as a Davidic Messiah. So the way it was traced in the what looks like Matthew, but wasn't really there, is what I'm saying. He put in Jechoniah, and I hate to say it, but Theodosian is very, very familiar with the Hebrew Bible, right? He's translated. He knows of Jeremiah. He's translated Jeremiah. So he knows you can put a poison pill in there and destroy a Davidic Messiahship. So he not only can do the translation, he knows how to destroy it. He knows how to change it just by one word. Just put in one word, Jechoniah, and you have now planted a seed that will destroy this religion eventually, unless they figure it out and block it and try to do what we're trying to do, which is expose it and make sure nobody ever gets the wrong idea, because we're proving who did it, why would they do it, and that why else is Symmachus being asked to step forward and defend the text the way it read originally. So obviously fair-minded Jewish people are going to go, okay, we can see Marcion was evil and he destroyed your scripture, added these words, was trying to sabotage Jesus. I mean, I don't think people have any animus against Jesus personally. Once you pull Paul aside, I think Jewish people go, well, Jesus has all the same doctrines we like, so we can believe in him. But right now, with Paul in there and with the virgin birth account the way it is, Jewish people would never consider Christianity. We have to change that picture. We need to give them the correct narrative, the truth, and they can come to Christ. But right now, all these Messianic Jews, they have to swallow this. They have to be told this is acceptable doctrine. This is acceptable doctrinally. It's not for them. They can't truly believe. They would have to suspend everything else about the law, that they just, we can just disregard Jeremiah's statement about Jechoniah. Anyway, let's continue here. So 4, it is not a coincidence then that Theodosian outlives Marcion, but was living in the same city as Marcion for all his life. So these two guys live in the same city. What's the chance that they come from the same city, that Theodosian translates Hebrew to Greek, that Theodosian knows the Hebrew Bible, would know the issue I just told you about Jechoniah, right? So, I mean, and we know that he's a Marcionite. We know he believes that Jesus was God from birth. We know he believes Jesus didn't really have true human flesh. Virgin birth fits that, right? So Theodosian is just as much motive really as Marcion does to make this story come alive and be attractive to normal Christians. And now it's going to eventually become so orthodox that the Ebionites are going to be considered the heretics trying to hold on to and preserve the Davidic Messiahship of Jesus. This is the bizarre situation we're in. Christians are fighting to resist getting rid of the virgin birth account, insisting that we have to have a passage that destroys the Messiahship of Jesus. This is what just confounds me to no end. This is what religious brainwashing does to you. You don't even see it happening to you, and that's how Satan works. You've got to break the chains, and I'm hoping these videos will show you the chains can be broken. We need to help our brothers and sisters who are Jewish find the Christ before they go to their grave. And we are the ones blocking them. We don't give them any avenue, any possibility that Jesus could be Messiah because of our love of the story of the nativity, the virgin birth, all of these things, the beautiful pictures, the paintings, all of that were all based on a lie. Yes, yes, yes. Sometimes things like that happen. It's called propaganda, and it was very successful. But it didn't come from us. It came from Marcion. All right, let me see if I have anything else. Okay, so let's look at Theodosian, whether he is the likely assistant. So we can all concur, I think, that a shipbuilder from Pontus who's living in a Greek-speaking city is not going to know how to translate Hebrew into Greek. But Theodosian, that's what he does for a living, or tried to do for a living. And so now let's read the details on that. Theodosian lived in the same city, Sinope of Pontus, as Marcion lived. So that's a dead giveaway. You know, so the plot of Marcion to go and send someone over to look at the Hebrew Matthew and Caesarea to make a translation, and then corrupt it, and then Marcion pay for a lot of copies to be made and keep circulating it, and then take over. That's not beyond a sneaky Marcion. And remember, what does Paul say? You know, if my lie promotes the gospel, then why am I still called a sinner? Romans 3:7. Marcion had learned from his master, which is lying for the good of the gospel is justified in no sin. Why am I a sinner? Marcion's going to go saying, I can't be blamed for any of this. And by the way, Marcion, I believe in eternal security. You can't lose your salvation. It's just affects works. So, you know, even if he does all this lying, but as long as he can tell God, I did it for you, I did it for you, the good God. Remember, he doesn't believe in Yahweh. He thinks Yahweh's the bad God. So he's going to go to his good God, which I believe is really, I don't want to tell you who I think it is, but that's another story. But he's going to go to God, his God, say, hey, I did this all for you because I'm lying and cheating and changing their work on their Bible, but it was to advance our gospel of Paul. Because he teaches, and he thinks, Paul teaches, that Jesus was a co-creator of the universe. And actually, Paul does say that in Colossians 1:17. You know, Jesus was before all time, and through him, God made the heavens and the earth. So, you know, Jesus is a superhuman God from birth. And now with the virgin birth, he can make that sound more legitimate. So let's read what McClintock and Strong Bible Encyclopedia says. According to Epiphanius, in that book there, De Pond et Mens, chapter, I guess it's chapter 17, verse 19, he was a native of Sinope in Pontus, where Marcion lives. I mean, come on, what's the chance that a translator of Hebrew to Greek would exist who knows the Hebrew Bible, who would know how to plant the seed on the issue of Jechoniah in the lineage of David, putting in the lineage of Jesus. Jechoniah would basically destroy any legitimacy that Jesus could ever be the Messiah. So that had to be somebody who had that kind of level of knowledge, and Jechoniah and Theodotion has that. Let's keep reading. And for a time he sided with the Marcionites. Now we don't know how much time or how little time. It could have been his whole life. I mean, he lives in the same city with Marcion. How could he ever really leave Marcion? I mean, he lives with him. He lives in the same city with him, but left them afterwards and became a Jew. Again, we don't have any dates. We don't know. It could have been very end of his life, around 200 AD. We don't know. And that's when he dies, around 200 AD. We find no trace of the Jews ever making use of his translation, and still less of it having been held in esteem by them. Much more was this, and it means to say the word esteem, much more was this esteem the case in the Christian, really Pauline church, which accepted his translation of Daniel for ecclesiastical use. He has translated a clause in Isaiah 25:8, now to get this, precisely as in 1 Corinthians 15:54, that's chapter 15, verse 54, but thoroughly deviating from the Septuagint. So that means that Theodosian, when he had a chance to go with the translation used by the Septuagint, he goes exactly with the way it is in Paul's version in 1 Corinthians 15:54, which means he's reading Paul, well, as a Marcionite. Who's the only apostle? Paul. So this is all they read, and they don't read Christ. And so the statement of McClintock and Strong is, this concurrence is probably not purely accidental, but is to be explained by Theodosian having appropriated him to himself the Pauline translation of the passage. And let me suggest, he is a Paulinist. And as a Paulinist, he believes in Romans 3, verse 7, right? And what does that say? Paul says, if through my lie the gospel increases or spreads, then why am I still called a sinner? So what is Theodosian doing when he makes the change? If he's the one, and that's what I'm saying, he has the morality of Paul. And Paul thinks anytime you lie for the gospel, and if you lied and put in a virgin birth account, which is completely fabricated, right? What kind of person does that? People who have the mentality of Romans 3, verse 7. Or you can pretend to be something you aren't, 1 Corinthians 8, 1 Corinthians 10. So Paul is his role model. And he even takes the lead from Paul's words and translations, and that proves he is intimately connected to Paul, and that's why he's willing to destroy the Hebrew original text that would destroy or to suit Marcion's view, and Marcion thought this was suitable to Paul, that Jesus was God from birth, that Jesus was co-creator of the universe, of the heavens and the earth, all of these things with the good God. So there's good God, and then there's Jesus God, and Jesus was God from birth. So this is something that you have to really understand. He believed he was God from birth, but when Tertullian is battling that, there's no virgin birth discussion because there's no virgin birth in 207 AD. All these against Marcion, yes, all these books against Marcion and the book In the Flesh, most importantly of all, Tertullian is not battling somebody who has a virgin birth account, who could have used that to say, hey, he didn't have flesh from birth, he was born God. What are you talking about? So that didn't even come up. So this is all post Tertullian 207 AD. There's no virgin birth yet, but maybe it's been made and it's circulating, but it's not taken over, and at least Tertullian is not. Marcionites are not pursuing that at that time with Tertullian, but it's going to become a very influential force in a very short order. So probably right after the books against Marcion, they start fighting back and start producing lots of copies of these fraudulent versions of the Gospels. Not that they didn't exist earlier, like around 160. One other thing we need to consider, the earliest alleged commentary that there was a virgin birth in the, quote, Fathers is Irenaeus, who dies around 160, the same point in time that Irenaeus dies. So it is possible that and Theodosian was living in Sinope this entire time with Marcion, okay? Marcion lived there for decades, right? So it is possible that the transmission of this work and doing all these subterranean things I'm suggesting could have happened as early as 160, and they just, it takes time to get your projects together and then make enough copies. You got to have people sit down, and you got to hire people to handwrite copies. There's no Xerox machines. There's no printers. You've got to do it. And so maybe this is all going on. It's taking a lot of time to revamp our word so it will suit the Marcionite position, but it had yet not been circulating. And it's possible nobody really suspected it was well, let's just put it this way. It didn't hit the pages, it didn't hit front headlines until the 200s, when the Ebionites then engaged Symmachus to fight them. So whatever it was too minor and too insignificant, or so far outside Jerusalem that our original church didn't even know about it. How's that? That'd probably be a better way of putting this. Okay, so I think that explains my theory, and let me see if there's another slide. Okay, so that ends this episode. So I think we now have the much more concrete basis for believing that Marcion was the source of the virgin birth account, using perfect person, Theodosian, his neighbor, his friend, his follower, Theodosian. And that's how it got done. And Theodosian would know how to plant that Jechoniah bomb. So the theory isn't not really a theory anymore. It's pulling itself together. And I think over time we're going to find more things. I just found this whole thing out about Theodosian today. I said, hey, let me go research his background. And what do you think? I thought the minute I saw he comes from the same identical city, Sinope. I mean, what's the chance of that? So you're on the right track when these kind of things just fall in your lap. Okay, God bless. Take care, everybody. Ciao. Bye.